Somewhere in space, this may all be happening right now. 20th Century Fox and George Lucas, the man who brought you American Graffiti, now bring you an adventure unlike anything on your planet. Star Wars.
Here they come. Coming too fast.
The story of a boy, a girl, and a universe. It's a big, sprawling space saga of rebellion and romance. It's a spectacle, light years ahead of its time.
I am C-3PO, human cyborg relations, and this is my counterpart, R2-D2.
Hello. No caution, no caution.
It's an epic of heroes.
Good luck.
And villains. And aliens from 1,000 worlds. Star Wars, 1 billion years in the making, and it's coming to your galaxy this summer.
Oh my goodness gracious. Woo!
All right, welcome everybody to God at the Movies, and we are clearly, I have a volume issue somewhere. Let's just, oh.
In 1976, George Lucas sat down to watch the first assembly.
All right, sorry about that. I was so excited. That's the original trailer of Star Wars. And that is only my second time ever seeing the original 70s trailer of Star Wars. So welcome everybody to God at the Movies. I am Vicar Chuck Shingledecker coming to you from Colfax, Wisconsin, which is a little town in Wisconsin that almost no one of you that is, unless you're part of my congregations, have ever heard of. But it's near Eau Claire, kind of east of the Twin Cities in that area. And joining us today is John Evans, and he's a colleague and a classmate of mine at Wartburg Theological Seminary. So, John, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, so as Chuck mentioned, my name is John Evans. I'm originally from Atlanta, Georgia. I am a second-year Master's of Divinity student at Wartburg Theological Seminary, and hoping to become a minister of Word and Sacrament in the ELCA, and maybe even go for a PhD to teach one day. And like Chuck, I'm a big fan of film, and I'm a big fan of seeing how God is speaking to us through the powerful medium that is the cinema, and especially Star Wars, which holds a special place in both of our hearts. So,
absolutely. Well, thank you for joining us today, for volunteering to be only in my second. Well, technically third, because my first episode ended up being two episodes. But thank you for joining us and joining me, and joining all my people that are hopefully listening to this. And welcome to all you out there, God at the Movies. Obviously, bear with us, or bear with me with some of the technology. I'm running this off of my laptop, which is it's new, but I don't have professional gear. I'm a seminarian and a student and a half-time vicar, which it's kind of a pastor, but not officially yet. So, So I don't have thousands of dollars of equipment, but we are here to talk and to do ministry and talk about God at the movies and in the movies. And so that's what we're here to talk about. We're here to talk about the first ever Star Wars. As you can see in my background, it just says Star Wars. None of this episode 4 New Hope stuff. It's just Star Wars. So, John, why don't you tell me the first time that you saw this film, and what was your experience with it, and how does it continue to influence you today?
Yeah, absolutely. So Star Wars is actually the first film I ever remember being cognizant of as I was watching it. I was 3 years old in Fort Worth, Texas. My parents had dropped me off at a babysitter's house, and the daughter of the babysitter grabbed the original Star Wars from the old VHS rack, pre-special edition, by the way, for those of you who get that, and said, "You know what? You probably like this." And she put in the video cassette, and apparently, according to eyewitnesses, I was standing so close to the screen that my nose was touching it. That's how engrossed I was in it, and I was in rapture. I fell in love with it, and to be honest, my biological mother in particular was a little bit angry that I'd been shown this because of her religious tradition and its, kind of issues with things like Star Wars and Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter. But she could not stop it because on the way home, I was humming the score. It was ingrained in me. I would go to sleep at night listening to the original scores for the original three films. And Star Wars has continued to be a huge, huge part of my life up to this day and my faith journey. There was a point in time when stories like Star Wars taught me more about the reality of God than Scripture could, at a time when I saw Scripture being used as a weapon to bludgeon people. Um, I adore the first film. Empire Strikes Back is my all-time favorite. I love Return of the Jedi. I love Rogue One. I love The Mandalorian. I'm so excited for all the new TV series that are going to be coming out. It's just a great time to be a Star Wars fan, but it's also a great time to talk about why is it that we love Star Wars so much? And it's not just because they're really great films. There are deeper reasons, and I'm really glad that we can talk about this today for that reason, Chuck. So
Yeah, awesome. That's a great story. I don't remember the first time I saw Star Wars. Like I've thought about this for years and I do not remember the first time I saw it.
oh wow.
When it came out in the theater, I was 1 year old. I didn't see it then, but I remember at some point when I was I must have been 4 years old. I remember having seen it somehow, in some way. And I remember, let's see, remember seeing Empire Strikes Back, which I must have seen in the theater at a very young age, but I don't really recall. I don't have a cognizant memory of seeing it in the theater, but I do remember when Return of the Jedi came out in 1983, this long anticipation of buildup and like, oh, it's going to come out. And I have very vivid memories of my mom and my friends and their parents and a whole group of us going to see Return of the Jedi. The last for us, that was going to be the last Star Wars.
One, yeah.
And I have very vivid memories of that. But I remember having some of the toys and friends that had toys long before Return of the Jedi. So it's always been there for me. Like I don't have oh, wow, that's fantastic. Awesome. It's always been there for me. So I don't remember a time without Star Wars. So, and for me, it's obviously it's a fun adventure, but I've seen it so often and it's been just a part of my entire life that like I'm always digging into like the interesting stuff, which is what we're going to do here. Yeah, let's begin. Like, what are your first impressions of what kind of themes have hit you with this movie? And we can kind of go from beginning to end, but we can hop around too. Let's just talk. What is it that stands out to you in particular?
Well, I think it's really important to kind of go into the process of how Star Wars was created a little bit. When George Lucas set out to do this, he was flying blind, and it's clear and apparent that he had to do a lot of reworking of the script to get it to where it was. And even then, things were changing on the set. But what he was trying to do was he was trying to create a modern mythology, a modern fantasy that had the trappings of Americana. And when I say Americana, I mean the old 1930s, 40s serials like Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers and all that. But George Lucas was also very much influenced, in particular, by the Japanese films of Akira Kurosawa, which were deeply rooted in mythology and anthropology, especially like Seven Samurai and Hidden Fortress. But also, too, he was deeply enamored with religion and spirituality. He, as far as I know, doesn't claim a specific one. But as he was writing Star Wars, he was very much ingraining himself in writings from Christianity, from Judaism, Buddhism, other Eastern spiritualities. And what he was attempting to do was to create this modern mythology that had a rootedness in a spirituality. In other words, that life is more than just this material realm that we live in, that we all have worth and value, and that there is a spiritual force, if you will, that binds all of us together. And he was trying to do this in combination with the classic old, tales of adventure that he grew up with, like Robin Hood, the other swashbuckling films of that time. And it's also important to know that when he first started doing this, nobody actually believed in it, really. A lot of people thought that this was just a really stupid film. Mm-hmm. And the process of making the film was absolute, if I may be frank, hell, because so many things went wrong in the making of it because they were trying to push the envelope of filmmaking. And by the time that they'd gotten to post-production, things were such a mess that he had to fire his editor because the cuts were not coming together. And so much of what makes the original film unique is how a lot of people came together to make something work that by all standards shouldn't have worked. And in some ways, the story of Star Wars kind of mirrors the story of the making of Star Wars. Because here you have all these scruffy newcomers and in a time and place in Hollywood where you had the new Hollywood movement with people like Francis Ford Coppola and Martin Scorsese. And here people were trying to make a film that was, trying to lift people up. And it came out in a time and place when there really wasn't that much hope in modern life because 1977, that was post-Vietnam, post-civil rights movement, in the middle of the early stages of feminism. And then also, too, you had a severe economic crisis. And so many of these films that were coming out in the 70s were really gritty and downbeat. Great films, though. I mean, you had Godfather, you had The Exorcist, you had other really, like Taxi Driver. You had all these wonderful films, but they weren't uplifting. And then Star Wars comes along and says, the old stories have not died. They're still with us. There is something in our world that binds us all together and says there is something higher that we are working for. And that includes justice, that includes freedom, and that includes respect for the dignity of all life. And so when the opening crawl first hits, I mean, it's pure exposition. But the brilliance of that first shot in particular that I love is that after the crawl comes up, the camera begins to pan down. And first you see a moon, and it looks familiar, right? Because we all have one moon in our sky. But then you see another moon, and then you see a planet that doesn't have a color context like Earth. And it's abidingly clear you aren't in Kansas anymore. And then you have the Rebel blockade runner that comes over. It's tiny. And then the Star Destroyer, it just keeps coming and coming and coming and coming. And what's so genius about that shot is that without any words, it shows this is how powerful evil is in this world. And this is how little good has to work with. And it sets it up so perfectly for that reason. So.
Yeah, that's a great, thank you for all of that. That's wonderful. One of the things that I find fascinating about, and you were talking about the kind of the religious applicability that Lucas kind of goes for, is also his influence by Joseph Campbell, and
Yes,
the power of
absolutely.
myth, and
Yes.
how myth is powerful in the human heart and the human psyche. And I'm not using myth in a pejorative sense. It's something that lifts us up and puts our minds on higher things more powerful than us, things greater than us. And for us Christians, the one who is all, the one who is greater than all, the one who created the cosmos and all the stars and all the galaxies. And so when you, as you said, that opening scene, when the ship, and it comes in, and it just keeps going on and on and on. And I think because we've seen it in our culture, we've seen so much of this in our culture now in film. And but at the time in 1977, no one had ever seen anything like this.
No.
Like not even 2001, which was very hard sci-fi, and that's a brilliant film in and of itself, but no one had seen anything like this before.
Well,
and no one had ever imagined something so huge and so enormous, and it just keeps coming and coming. And imagining what that would be like on the big screen for the very first time Star Wars changed the face of cinema forever.
It did. And it's funny because my dad actually saw it the week after it came out. He packed 10 of his friends into a Ford LTD and drove from Jasper, Georgia to Marietta, Georgia, which is a suburb right outside of Atlanta. And he said that when those ships came over, he said the entire air was sucked out of the room because people were just like, whoa. And he said that he teared up just because of how powerful it was. And the music in particular was what was conveying this awe-inspiring sight that was being on screen. So, yeah.
And you had talked about, the power of evil. And I think that's, as you talked about the context and the cultural context, not only is Star Wars significant from a cinematic point of view, but from a cultural point of view, because as you said, it's not that many years after the Vietnam War ended, and still feeling the repercussions of that in very real ways. And this was the first movie where it gave people hope.
Yes.
In story. And I think that's what myth does so beautifully. And that is the power of myth, to borrow from Joseph Campbell.
Yes.
And ultimately that good, even if it's the underdog, can conquer and overcome evil. And so I think it's a great jumping off point to kind of jump into the story itself. And of course, we see at the beginning, we see, Princess Leia, and like, you don't know who she is. She's got the funny hair, and you're like, what's this? And she like gives something to the robots, and the robots go away. And then we see Darth Vader, who's obviously the villain. He's dressed in all black. He has a terrible, like, booming voice. And he's, it's brutal, like but he murders a guy, right? Strangles a guy because he doesn't even know his own power. And so there's all this like coming at us as an audience and as a viewer, and you realize, boy, this princess is in big trouble.
Yep.
And then we follow the robots, and they get to the planet, and they meet the farm boy, and we'll get to that in a minute. But just your thoughts on like the introduction of evil in Darth Vader.
Yeah, well, one of the things that is so profoundly genius about how George Lucas, Norman Reynolds, the production designer of the film, John Mullen, the costume designer, and Ralph McQuarrie and Joe Johnston, who are the concept designers, one of the things that they really harnessed into was a color scheme for evil that people might not recognize immediately, but subconsciously they do. Because what are the colors of the Empire? Red, white, and black.
Mm-hmm.
Those are three colors from totalitarian regimes, be it the Soviet Union or the Third Reich with Nazi Germany. And it is no accident that the stormtroopers are called stormtroopers. And it's also no accident that Darth Vader's helmet looks exactly like what became known as the upside down coal kettle that German soldiers wore in at the end of World War I and during World War II. What's also quite brilliant in terms of is with the role of evil and how it is portrayed is that there is barely any dialogue within that first moment of the film. When we see the stormtroopers first time, they just burst in, no talking. It's just death instantly. And you see the fear on those rebel soldiers' faces. They know that they are about to get slaughtered, but they stay there anyway. And it's a testament to, and it made me wonder as a kid, how much was I willing to sacrifice for good? Even if it meant that I was just a body that was stopping something or a group of people from being able to get where they were coming after. And it's hard not to see parallels with getting a message out, broadcasting this hope. It's really hard for me not to see the parallels between a prophetic message of hope and the parallels in scripture of how there was an attempt to kill that prophetic message before it even came into being.
Mm-hmm.
And it really speaks to the banality of evil. It also speaks to how evil has a way of erasing identity. We don't ever see stormtroopers' faces. They're just cogs in the machine. And that's also a critique of totalitarianism, particularly, I would argue, Marxism and communism, is that it takes away individuality of a human being, and it makes you just one more piece in a machine. And it's usually a machine of death. And with that too, once the droids do escape, they land on this desert planet, which, you know, it's hard not to see the parallels there of wandering in the wilderness, so to speak, with a message. And the interesting thing with all of this is that R2-D2 knows what's going on, and C-3PO is just being his usual annoying self.
Yeah.
But R2 should probably try to communicate to C-3PO a little bit better than just saying, I have a mission, you know?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned the color scheme, and just not only not only the historicity of that color scheme, but like the symbolism, black and white. I mean, what do we say? Some people like seeing black and white, right and wrong, with no shades of gray, no color, no diversity. It's this or it's this. You fit in this box or you're out of the box. Yep. And that's another like symbol of the empire, is that you're either one of them and you are unquestioning in your fealty to the movement of the empire, or you're one of the rebels, or one of the poor slobs that is just getting crushed by the empire. And then we get to Tatooine, the desert planet where the droids have escaped, and we begin to see what it's like to be a regular person in this world. We see what it's like to be a poor farmer. We meet Luke for the first time, and Uncle Owen, and we get to kind of know that his family. And it's this kind of backwoods, well, it's not a woods, it's this back desert place. And there's nothing there. And we kind of talked about this before we began, and I hate to jump to it, but I'm going to, is that we just recently had the text in the lectionary where Philip is talking to Nathaniel and saying, hey, we found the Messiah, come follow him. And Nathaniel says, what good can come from this?
Come out of Nazareth.
Place of Nazareth. Like,
yeah,
you know.
What good can come out of Tatooine, right?
Right. What good can come out of Tatooine, and what good can come out of the desert? And there's just, it's little farm boy. What does he know? What is he good at?
Yeah.
And it's kind of, it echoes the, the critiques of Jesus in the Gospels. Like, "Oh, isn't this the carpenter's son? Like, what does he know? Who is he? Who does he think he is?" And Luke is, I mean, clearly not an allegory of Jesus, but he is kind of a messianic figure. He's a Christ, he's an image of Christ. He's a Christ-like figure. And again, Lucas isn't necessarily going for that directly, but there's this applicability, and which is certainly there. And the Christian perspective, we would see him as he's a bringer of light. He's one that's
he's a Skywalker. He's one that's what I've always loved about that name. Is it's almost as if it's a name that it implies someone who somehow walks the divide between heaven and earth, or shall we say the infinite and the finite, the material and the spiritual. I don't think that name is accidental by any means.
Right. I mean, it sounds cool. But yeah, there's it also, the name also foreshadows, clearly, I've forgotten to mention this, but spoilers. So I don't know, like, it's been what, 40 some years. I think maybe the spoiler alert is old, but in case you've never seen it, stop now, go watch it, and then come back.
Seriously though.
Right. But it foreshadows what he's going to become. That
absolutely
name.
Absolutely. And he's very much a representation of the every person in a way, and that he's stuck in this place that he doesn't want to be in. He wants to go off and become a pilot and fight in the rebellion and all this stuff, but his uncle in particular is keeping him there. And at this point in the story, we don't know why, but one of the more brilliant things in that whole Uncle Owen arc is that there's a moment when Luke, in frustration, leaves the dinner table after he's, found the message from Princess Leia, and it's invigorated him to go even more forward with this call of adventure. And his aunt says to his uncle, he can't stay here forever. He's got a higher calling. And his uncle goes, "That's what I'm afraid of." And he specifically mentions that right after the aunt says he has too much of his father in him.
He has too much of his father in him. That's what I'm afraid of.
Yeah.
And whether or not, like, the intention at that point, when they made Star Wars, I mean, there's been conflicting information.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, Uncle George Lucas, he always, like, he says he had it all planned out, but
didn't.
Right, he didn't. I mean, if you go back and listen to early interviews from him, like, he had no idea where the story was going. They were making it up, as you said, on the fly, and so we don't know that that's where it was going. But clearly, in this story, when he finally meets Obi-Wan Kenobi, Obi-Wan tells him that his father fought in the rebellion and was killed. And so it could just be reference to that, that he's got too much father in him, that he's going to end up dead like his father.
Yeah.
And speaking of Obi-Wan, like, I've been thinking about this, and he's an interesting figure. Obviously, he comes in like a mentor figure.
Yes.
Obviously, that it has been seen throughout religious history over and over again, and myths throughout the ages. But I can't help but see him as like John the Baptist in this.
Yes.
He's initiating Luke, Jesus, into this other world, and someone that comes from this humble beginning from nowhere is meeting this Obi-Wan, charismatic, not in the way that John the Baptist would have been, but there's something about him. You're like, oh, he knows something. Like, what is with this guy?
He's that crazed old hermit that lives out in the wilderness, just like John did. And I gotta tell you, there's a music cue that happens right when Luke asks Obi-Wan, whom he just knows as Ben Kenobi at that point, because he didn't know that Ben was an alternate identity. But when Luke asks, he claims to be the droid that has run away, that has the message, is trying to get to Obi-Wan, because that's what Princess Leia has been attempting to do, because Obi-Wan was a Jedi at one point, but has been in hiding since the purge from the Empire. But there's a music cue when Luke asks him, do you know who Obi-Wan is? Do you know who he's talking about? And there's this strange musical cue that occurs. And I have to say that for some reason, whenever I hear it, I'm always reminded of that moment in the Gospel of John, where John the Baptist sees Jesus, and he points and he says, "Behold the Lamb of God who taketh away the sins of the world." But there's also another feeling that I get from that music, and it's almost as if you would hear that same music in your head when Jesus finds you and calls your name. And, we were talking about the passage from last week with how Jesus clearly found Nathanael sitting under the fig tree, even though Nathanael didn't know he was there.
Yeah.
And it speaks to the power that music plays in conveying emotion and the reality of what's going on. Because what is going on there is that not only is Luke stepping into this world, Obi-Wan is having to come back into it after hiding for years and years and years. And he is being confronted with his own past in a way, which was very traumatic. I love that imagery that you have there of Obi-Wan being almost like John the Baptist in a way.
Yeah. And of course he introduces Luke to the lightsaber, and which you showed us.
Yep, this is a model of the very same one, actually, that Luke used and that Rey would use in the sequel trilogy too. So it's my favorite lightsaber and hilt for sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I haven't, do you feel like there's symbolism in the lightsaber? Do you feel like it represents something, or is it just something cool that space wizards have?
It's mythologically, and Campbell talked about this too, where the mentor will give the youth something useful. But at the same time, it's hard not to see the parallels between, the lightsaber and say something like Excalibur. This weapon of, a different time, an otherworldly time, or as Obi-Wan put it, a weapon for a more civilized age, right? It's this passing down of the torch in some ways. And of course, within that same scene, with the passing down of the torch, Obi-Wan explains to Luke the very thing that is the fabric of the universe in which they live in, which is the Force. And it's in the way that Obi-Wan describes it is, the Force is what gives a Jedi his power. It's an energy field created by all living things that surrounds us, penetrates us, it binds the galaxy together. Now, I'll be the first to say, I like Yoda's description of the Force a little bit better, because it's definitely more rooted in, shall we say, language of the Holy Spirit. What Obi-Wan is describing is more, I would say it's more akin to something like Chi, the life force. I would also say that it probably has its root, this version of it that we see from Obi-Wan's description is a little bit more rooted in Asian philosophy and religion, more of what we would call, what's the term? It starts with a D. I can't remember it, but it'll come back to me at some point. But yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad you got into the Force, because I want to focus on just Star Wars, and not, I mean, we reference Yoda, and that's okay. I don't want to get too much into that, because I feel like the first Star Wars, like, it stands on its own, and it has this unique thing that you could watch the first Star Wars and theoretically enjoy it and be like, I'm done. I don't need 47 more movies or however many it's going to be by the end,
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so but obviously in the later movies, we do get more Holy Spirit imagery, more applicability, which for us Christians is like really exciting. You said, we don't get that quite as much here, but there is the whole sense of, as the film. Well, let's see. Let's not jump too far ahead. So he meets ObiWan, and they find out that Luke's family has been killed by stormtroopers, who, interestingly enough, in like the first Star Wars, are actually good at their job. It's been turned into a joke. Because of the rest of the movies, and over 30, like, they can't hit anything, but they're actually like really efficient in this first film. Like, they do really good, like they're obliterating the good guys, and they're wiping out, Jawas, and I mean, later on, it's this kind of internal joke that Star Wars fans make about stormtroopers can't. Their aim is terrible, and they can't do their job, and but in the first movie, like, the intention, and we see it, is that they're really efficient. And so they're originally intended to be like terrifying, and later on not so much. But so then Luke says, "Well, I have nothing here." So like they go and find to find a way off Tatooine, and where they eventually meet Han Solo and Chewbacca. And the interesting thing about when they meet them is they go into the bar, right? And contrasting the Empire, which is black and white, two colors, you're in or you're out. They go into the bar, and it's species from everywhere. It's so, and I know like I'm going to use the word, even though like some science fiction and fantasy fans online do not care for it. It's so diverse.
Yes,
it is. There are weird creatures that look. There's just
they have biology and anatomy that you wouldn't even like imagine unless you had the most creative mind. And I want to come back. I want to come back to the Cantina scene, but I'd actually like to go back to the scene where Luke finds his uncle and aunt. Actually, because ObiWan says to Luke, "You must learn the ways of the Force if you want to come with me to help continue the rebellion and save the princess." And Luke rejects the call. He says, "No, I got to help my uncle. I got to do this. I got to yada 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 yada." And here's the thing: for those of us who have wrestled with the call to ministry, or the call to something else that requires sacrifice and service, we've all had that moment where we have been like Luke, and we have said, "I can't get involved. I've got work to do. It's not like I like the Empire, I hate it, but there's nothing I can do about it. I'm just one small person." And then with the death of his aunt and uncle, which he sees in full, he sees that they have been burned alive. And he is faced with the reality that this isn't just about him now. This is about the entire galaxy. And it's that understanding of responsibility that the call brings, and that it's hard not to see the parallels, in particular with Moses in the scene, with how Moses ran and then was confronted by God and said, "No, I can't do this." And God says, "You really don't have a choice, man. This is
Mhm.
what you've been called. But going back to the Cantina Scene, sorry to take that slight
No,
detour.
I'd like to just jump in. I'm glad that you like jumped back to that because it had just escaped me that is absolutely a like being called moment and saying no. And I
Yep.
know there's the power of myth and Joseph Campbell and all, but I mean, this is a real thing that we
Yes.
all, I think everyone listening to this has experienced at some point in their lives. It doesn't matter if you're not in ministry. Um, you've been confronted with something that you knew you should be doing,
Mm.
and for some reason, maybe for great reasons, you said no, and it wasn't until later where you came back and said yes. And that is very much how it is. My call journey to ministry is, I mean, I said no a whole lot, and
Yep. Same
you
here,
know
brother. Yeah.
and so in that moment where Luke, I mean, for Luke, everything is taken from him. Like there's nothing left for him.
Nothing left for him. Yeah.
And yeah, and he's like, well, I guess I'm going.
Yeah.
you
I mean,
know?
he literally says to Obi-Wan, there's nothing for me here now. I want to learn the ways of the Force and become a Jedi like my father. And you know, you see this with call stories all the time of how, and like you, I kept saying no, 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 no. But eventually God has a way of getting our attention. God has a way of pulling the proverbial rug out from under us. God has a way of taking us when we're off doing what we think we should be doing and going, that's adorable. I'm going to put you here. And
Right. And that sense of, I mean, not in the literal sense, but that the sense of there are no other options. Like
yeah,
this is the path that I have to be on because there's nothing left.
there's literally nothing left. Exactly.
And not that, like, I mean, my family's alive, stormtroopers didn't come in and kill everybody I know, but that it's that same feeling. It
Yes.
is or a similar feeling. It's that I've tried everything I can to not do this.
Hmm. Absolutely.
I can't say no now. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, it's a very real. I mean, how many of our colleagues and classmates and people, pastors that we know have had that? Not all of them, but a great many of them have had that very
Yes.
same experience. And yeah, and so it's a very significant moment in the film, and
Yes.
the big decision,
Yes.
that the hero
Absolutely.
makes,
And then that leads back into the Cantina Scene, which I love that you brought up the whole diversity thing, because here you have this kid that has been, way out in the hinterlands. He hasn't had much exposure to what the real world is like, so to speak. So it's almost like, a kid like myself who grew up in the rural South of Louisiana, Texas, North Carolina, and Georgia. And then in high school, I moved to Atlanta. I went to a high school that was 85% African American. And I, was confronted with worlds and realities that I had never seen before. And the Cantina Scene is a great example, going back to Joseph Campbell, of what he called the crossing the threshold moment. The moment where you profoundly realize you aren't in Kansas anymore and that you're going into a weird place that's very dangerous, and the folks aren't going to be like the folks back home. And that's what's so brilliant about what you just described, that, all these different aliens speaking all these different languages, drinking all these different drinks, with that music going in the background that was clearly influenced by Benny Hinn and, Buddy Rich and all the other kind of jazz artists. It's very much like walking into like a Western bar or a 20s, very seedy jazz club where there's probably some cannabis being smoked or, whatever, right? But
whatever they're growing on Tatooine.
yeah, whatever they're smoking on Tatooine, right? Which it ain't moisture, let me tell you that.
That's right.
But yeah, and how Luke it's made clear up front to Luke, you're the fresh kid off the farm, because he runs into this guy who drunkenly threatens him and says, I have the death sentence on 12 systems. And Luke is like, yeah, I'll be careful. And he goes, you'll be dead. And it's only Obi-Wan that saves him. And it's interesting because that scene it also established this is how powerful Obi-Wan is.
Right.
He barely uses his lightsaber, and these punks are just taken out like that.
Yeah.
But what's also brilliant too is that just like every other like Western bar scene in any film, whether it's, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, or Silverado, or any of the classics, the moment that the violence is over, everyone that's looking just goes right back to their business.
Right.
And that speaks to the Western influence of Star Wars, which shows up a lot more so in The Mandalorian later on. But you see all these different tropes and the genius of what's going on with that scene of how it's trying to establish you ain't in Kansas anymore, and here's the real world, bucko, buckle up.
Right. And of course, at that moment is when they meet, or in the cantina is when they meet Han. And
yes,
he is like a cowboy,
he's the original space cowboy.
Right, you're right.
Yeah.
But he's the one that's like, he's the cowboy, like he's a good guy, but there's something seedy about him,
He's the thief with a heart of gold.
Right.
And Han's arc is interesting because he has his own hero's journey. Luke has a little bit of a different kind of a hero's journey. Because Luke is someone who cares. Luke is someone who has empathy for what's going on around him. Luke is someone that has a special connection to the spiritual reality of the Force. Han's a scruffy nerf herder smuggler that has a blaster on his belt that's nothing more than a German Mauser with a scope and a flash suppressor. And he's, very kind of a seedy character. And yet at the same time, we find seedy characters like that in scripture who turn out to do great things.
Mm-hmm.
And honestly, with Han, he kind of reminds me of Jacob in some ways. That kind of shrewd trickster that knows how to make the right moves.
Mm-hmm.
But Han also has a kind of spiritual revelation or epiphany later on in the series, but that's not what we're talking about. But at the time we meet him, he's just this world-weary cynic that doesn't believe in any kind of higher reality. All he believes is just getting by on enough money because he and Chewie are clearly running space drugs across the galaxy.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. He's a smuggler he's, and of course, this is when we, it's in that sequence where he, the whole Greedo sequence where,
oh God.
Han shot first. Just
Han did. Well, actually, I will just say Han shot. Greedo didn't even shoot.
Right. Greedo didn't even shoot.
Didn't even fire a shot.
Yeah. So, for those that don't know what we're talking about, there's this scene with Han and a bounty hunter that comes to arrest Han and take him to Jabba, and that's all we hear about is Jabba. He owes this gangster named Jabba some money, and he's like, I'm going to take you back and collect my bounty. And then Han just boom, straight up blasting away.
Without any awkward neck shifts that are so inhuman that were changed in the special edition. That, it's a point of controversy for sure amongst a lot of Star Wars fans. And even post George Lucas owning Disney, no original cuts of the film have been released to us for consumer. We only have the special edition content, which that's a whole other topic in of itself. That's a rabbit hole we can't go down.
We can't. We definitely don't have time to go down that rabbit hole. But what we do have time for is to. I think we're going to break this up into 2 episodes.
Just like the last one.
Time for this session is up. However, Join us next time when we continue our conversation on Star Wars, and we will see you then. For now, this is Vicar Chuck and my guest John Evans signing off for God at the Movies.